Picture this. You bought your car new. You changed the oil on schedule. You never redlined it, never neglected it, never treated it badly, and yet, somewhere around the 45,000-mile mark, it starts to stumble at stoplights. It hesitates when you merge onto the highway. The check engine light comes on for no reason you can explain. You take it to a shop, and the technician says 2 words that make your stomach drop. Carbon buildup, or worse, 3 words, low-speed pre-ignition. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. You didn't do anything wrong. The thing quietly working against your engine isn't a mechanical flaw. It isn't bad luck. It's sitting in your gas tank right now, and it has been there every single time you've filled up for years. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because by the end of this, you're going to look at the gas pump completely differently, and you'll know exactly what to do about it. And if engineering stories like this one get your brain working, stick around and subscribe. Because this is exactly the kind of deep dive breakdown this channel lives for, a decision made before most of us were driving. To understand what's happening under your hood today, we have to go back to a regulatory decision most drivers have never heard of. In 1978, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency granted a waiver under the Clean Air Act that permitted fuel refiners to blend up to 10% ethanol into gasoline. Ethanol is a plant-derived alcohol distilled mainly from corn that burns cleaner than petroleum and boosts octane. The blend picked up the name E10. Nobody made a fuss about it. Gas stations weren't required to advertise it. Automakers of that generation, big, simple, forgiving engines with carburetors or the earliest electronic fuel systems, barely noticed the difference. By the 1990s, E10 had quietly become the default fuel at nearly every pump in the country. Today, ethanol is present in more than 98% of the gasoline sold in the United States. That's not a niche additive anymore. That is the fuel supply, and it isn't standing still. The next chapter is already unfolding as you're watching this in 2026. The EPA issued its 5th consecutive emergency waiver, allowing E15 15% ethanol to be sold nationwide through the entire summer driving season, something that used to be legally restricted because of vapor pressure rules. E15 is now available at close to 5,000 stations across the country, often marketed under the name Unleaded 88, and it typically undercuts regular gasoline by around 28 cents a gallon. Cheaper fuel sounds like nothing but good news. But cheaper isn't the same as harmless, and that distinction is where this story really begins. Not every automaker has been comfortable with that math. BMW refused to approve E15 for any vehicle built before the 2020 model year. Nissan only cleared it for select models from 2018 onward. Mitsubishi still hasn't approved it across its full lineup. The people who regulate the fuel and the people who build the engines that burn it have not always agreed on what's actually safe. And that disagreement should tell you something. Why ethanol is fighting your engine from the inside. Here's a property of ethanol that almost never comes up in casual conversation, and it's the root of nearly everything that follows. Ethanol is hygroscopic. It doesn't just tolerate water, it actively pulls it in, the way a sponge pulls in moisture from humid air. On a molecular level, ethanol carries a hydroxyl group that forms hydrogen bonds with water. Plain gasoline doesn't have that vulnerability. Ethanol does. Think about how many places that fuel passes through before it ever reaches your engine. A storage tank at the refinery, a tanker truck rolling across the country, the underground tank at your local station, the vent in your own fuel cap. At every single one of those handoffs, there's a pocket of humid air waiting to be absorbed. Ethanol-blended fuel is essentially collecting water the entire time it travels toward you, and it keeps collecting water even after it's sitting in your tank doing nothing. In older engines, this was mostly an annoyance. Water would settle at the bottom of the tank and occasionally cause a rough cold start. Inconvenient but survivable. In a modern car, the stakes are dramatically higher. Today's direct injection systems push fuel through injectors at pressures that can exceed 3,000 pounds per square inch, spraying it through openings narrower than a strand of human hair. When water-contaminated fuel hits precision components engineered to those tolerances, you get corrosion, disrupted spray patterns, and deposits that choke off fuel delivery from the inside. There's an even more dramatic failure mode most drivers have never heard of: phase separation. Once ethanol-blended fuel absorbs roughly 0.5% of its volume in water, the ethanol and water physically split away from the gasoline and sink to the bottom of the tank as a separate layer. That layer sits directly above the fuel pump intake, which means it's the very first thing pulled into your engine. Instead of clean combustible fuel, the engine suddenly receives a slug of water-heavy, low-octane liquid. The result can be stalling, violent misfires, and in the worst cases, real corrosion damage to fuel lines, pump housings, and injector bodies. Now think about every vehicle that spends long stretches sitting still. A classic car under a cover, a boat on a trailer through the off-season, a motorcycle parked for the winter, a generator, or a mower in the shed. None of those engines are running, but the ethanol inside them never stops working. It keeps absorbing moisture from the surrounding air the entire time the vehicle sits idle. By the time the owner turns the key again, the damage has often already happened quietly inside the lines in the carburetor bowl. This is the detail that gets flattened into a soundbite. Bad gas causes a rough idle. That framing misses what's actually going on. This isn't a single bad tank of fuel. It's a slow, cumulative erosion, a little more moisture with every fill-up, a little more corrosive residue with every heat cycle, working on rubber seals, gaskets, and aluminum fittings over tens of thousands of miles. Multiply that across 5 years and 75,000 miles of ordinary commuting, and you start to understand why this is a genuine engineering problem, and not just an urban legend mechanics like to repeat. The trade-off nobody put in the brochure. Direct injection technology made all of this considerably more complicated. And here's the part that almost never gets explained clearly. For decades, gasoline engines used port fuel injection, spraying fuel into the intake manifold before it ever reached the valves. As that fuel-air mixture flowed past the intake valves on its way into the cylinder, the gasoline's detergent additives literally washed over the valve surfaces on every single cycle. Nobody designed that as a cleaning feature. It was a happy accident of the layout, but it worked invisibly for the entire life of the engine. Then the industry shifted toward gasoline direct injection, or GDI, spraying fuel straight into the combustion chamber instead. The upside was real: tighter control of the air-fuel mixture, more power from a smaller displacement, better numbers on the emissions test bench. By the mid-2010s, GDI had become nearly universal. Volkswagen's TSI engines, Ford's EcoBoost lineup, Hyundai and Kia's Theta and GDI families. It looked, on paper, like a straightforward win. Nobody advertised the trade-off. With fuel now bypassing the intake valves completely, nothing was washing them anymore. Meanwhile, oily vapor from the engine's crankcase ventilation system kept drifting past those same valves. And with no detergent bath to rinse it away, that residue baked onto the valve necks under combustion heat, cycle after cycle. The buildup is gradual, which is exactly why it's so easy to miss. Somewhere around 30,000 miles, symptoms start creeping in: rough idle at a stoplight, a flat spot under acceleration, a misfire that trips the check engine light. Push past 60,000 miles, and the deposits can become severe enough to require walnut shell blasting of the intake ports, or in stubborn cases, a full cylinder head replacement. Repair costs range from a few $100s for a cleaning to several thousand for head work on an engine that is otherwise completely healthy. Toyota's engineers saw this coming early and built a genuinely clever workaround called D4s, which pairs both port injectors and direct injectors on every cylinder. At low load, the port injectors fire and bathe the valves in detergent, keeping them clean the old-fashioned way. Under hard acceleration, the direct injectors take over for maximum efficiency. It first appeared in the Lexus IS350 back in 2006 and later spread through the Toyota lineup, including the 86 and the RAV4 and Camry hybrid. Ford eventually adopted a similar dual injection approach in its own EcoBoost engines. The fact that two of the industry's biggest players felt compelled to build this kind of redundancy into their engines tells you the carbon deposit problem was never a minor footnote. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If two major automakers thought this problem was serious enough to justify doubling the injection hardware in every cylinder, why does almost nobody outside the industry know this trade-off even exists? Drop your own guess in the comments. I want to know if you'd ever heard of dual injection before this. The failure mode that can destroy an engine in seconds. Now combine everything you just learned: direct injection, turbocharging, and a fuel supply carrying more ethanol every year, and you get a phenomenon that terrifies engineers far more than carbon deposits ever could: low-speed pre-ignition, or LSPI. In a healthy engine, the spark plug fires at a precisely calculated instant during the compression stroke. With LSPI, something else ignites the fuel-air mixture, first often a stray droplet of oil or fuel, or a flake of detached carbon deposit, acting as an unplanned hotspot. Combustion begins while the piston is still traveling upward, and the resulting pressure spike can hit 2 to 3 times the normal peak cylinder pressure the engine was ever designed to survive. The physical damage is not subtle. LSPI can shatter piston rings, bend connecting rods, and crack ringlands or punch straight through a piston crown, all in a single event. Technicians who've pulled apart engines after an LSPI failure have described finding connecting rod bearings crushed as flat as aluminum foil. There's no slow warning here, no gradual decline you can catch early. Just a sharp metallic knock from under the hood, and then a very expensive phone call to the shop. Here's the genuinely unnerving part. LSPI doesn't strike during hard aggressive driving at high RPM, which is where you'd instinctively expect engine stress to peak. It strikes at low engine speeds, typically between 15,500 and 2,500 RPM. Under heavy throttle load, exactly the conditions of merging onto a freeway from a stop sign, or climbing a steep grade in a tall gear. In other words, the exact kind of routine. Everyday driving you do without thinking dozens of times a week. Researchers across Japan, Germany, and the United States traced part of the root cause to calcium-based detergent additives commonly used in motor oil, which were contributing to the ignition hotspots behind LSPI events. The industry response was the APISP oil specification, introduced in 2020, which reformulated detergent chemistry to reduce calcium content in favor of magnesium-based alternatives. But here's the detail almost nobody covering this topic has caught up on yet. APISP is no longer the newest defense. In March 2025, the American Petroleum Institute rolled out an even more advanced standard, APISQ, aligned with the ILC GF7 specification. Engineers discovered that even LSPI-resistant oil loses some of its protective chemistry. As it ages in the crankcase, the calcium and magnesium additives shift structurally over thousands of miles, and the risk of pre-ignition can creep back in well before your next scheduled oil change. APISQ specifically tests for that aged oil vulnerability, alongside a new timing chain wear test designed to stop soot particles from grinding away at chain links inside direct injection engines. If you're driving a modern turbocharged direct injection vehicle, which statistically you probably are, this is the single most current thing you can check before your next oil change. Not just APISP, but whether SQ and GF7 certified oil is now available and recommended for your engine. If your jaw is on the floor right now knowing your engine could be sitting on a landmine every time you merge onto a highway, that reaction is completely fair. That's exactly why this kind of story deserves more attention than it gets, and exactly why hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. The engineers who saw this coming. This is where a press conference in Tokyo in 2024 suddenly makes a lot more sense. Toyota, Mazda, and Subaru stood together and announced they were jointly developing a new generation of combustion engines. The press language leaned heavily on carbon neutrality and e-fuels, and it would have been easy to file that under routine corporate messaging. It wasn't. Toyota is engineering new inline-4 architectures built from the ground up for compatibility with e-fuels, biofuels, and liquid hydrogen. Mazda is reviving its rotary platform under a next-generation design, bringing one of the most unusual engine layouts in automotive history into an entirely new fuel era. Subaru is reworking its horizontally opposed boxer engine to preserve the low center of gravity that has defined the brand for decades, while rebuilding the internals for fuels that barely existed in commercial form when the original boxer was conceived. As of this year, the three companies have confirmed their commitment to what they're calling a multi-pathway approach engines, engineered to work seamlessly alongside electric drive units rather than in competition with them. More compact, more powerful, and deliberately fuel-flexible from the start. Why would three fierce rivals coordinate this closely on something as fundamental as engine architecture? Because Japan's own fuel supply is about to shift under everyone's feet. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry has laid out a roadmap moving the country away from its historical EPB-based system toward direct ethanol blending nationwide E10 by 2030, with regional pilot programs beginning near refineries as early as 2028, and a further push toward E20 by 2040. These aren't distant hypotheticals. This is a fuel transition already in motion, on a fixed government timeline. Toyota's president, Koei Sato, and his counterparts at Mazda and Subaru framed the announcement around carbon neutrality, and that part is genuine. But underneath the optimistic language sits a much more sober engineering calculation. The chemistry of the fuel is changing, and engines built for today's blend may not survive tomorrow's. That's not speculation dressed up as marketing. That's three of the most conservative, Reliability-obsessed engineering cultures in the industry publicly signaling that they see a serious problem coming and choosing to redesign from scratch rather than patch around it later. At Expo 2025 in Osaka, vehicles from 5 Japanese automakers ran on synthetic fuel produced at a demonstration facility that came online in late 2024, currently capable of producing roughly 42 gallons of synthetic gasoline per day. 42 gallons a day is nowhere close to commercial scale. This is proof of concept, not infrastructure. But the underlying message is unmistakable. These companies are not waiting for a crisis to force their hand. They are redesigning the hardware in parallel with the fuel itself, because they've already watched what happens when fuel chemistry outruns engine engineering, what you can actually do about this right now. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who wants to actually protect the car sitting in your driveway rather than just worry about it. So let's make this practical. First, look for top-tier certified gasoline. This is an independent standard requiring a meaningfully higher concentration of detergent additives than the federal minimum, and it's the fuel-side counterpart to good motor oil. Independent testing over roughly 30,000 miles has shown measurably lower intake valve deposit formation in engines running top-tier fuel compared to minimum-spec gasoline. Shell, Chevron, and Costco all carry the designation along with a long list of regional suppliers. It's worth a quick search to confirm your usual station qualifies. Second, if you own a turbocharged direct injection vehicle, and again, the odds say you probably do, check your oil bottle for API-SP at minimum and start asking your service center whether the newer API-SQ and ILSA GF7 oils are recommended for your specific engine. This isn't a marketing sticker. It's the difference between oil that resists LSPI when it's fresh and oil engineered to keep resisting it as it ages between changes. Third, change one small driving habit. Avoid mashing the throttle at low RPM. If you need to accelerate hard, let the transmission downshift and allow engine speed to climb first before applying full power. That single habit keeps you out of the exact RPM window where LSPI is statistically most likely to strike. Fourth, stay current on your engine's software. Automakers routinely release EQ calibration updates that adjust spark timing, valve timing, and boost pressure specifically to reduce carbon accumulation and LSPI risk. A 10-minute reflash during a routine service visit can be more protective than people realize. The bigger picture. None of this makes ethanol a villain. It genuinely reduces certain tailpipe emissions, it supports domestic agriculture, and it stretches a finite gasoline supply further than pure petroleum ever could. Those benefits are real, and real people depend on them. The problem is that the costs of this trade-off tend to stay invisible until the repair bill lands in your hands: a corroded fuel pump at 40,000 miles. A walnut shell valve cleaning at 60,000, an injector replacement that quietly erases a decade's worth of savings at the pump, the engineers building D4s, mapping LSPI, and designing engines for fuels that barely exist at commercial scale, yet aren't doing this because they enjoy complexity for its own sake. They understand something that tends to get lost in policy debates. An engine is a precision machine converting chemical energy into motion through thousands of controlled explosions every single minute. Shift the chemistry of that fuel by even a handful of percentage points, and you shift the thermal loads, the combustion pressures, and the corrosion behavior acting on every seal, valve, injector, piston, and bearing in the system. As of mid-2026, Japan is preparing regional E10 trials for 2028 ahead of a national rollout in 2030. The United States has now issued 5 consecutive years of summer E15 waivers, with permanent year-round legislation still stalled in Congress. Brazil has run E27 for years with a flex fuel fleet purpose-built for it. India mandates E20 nationwide. The direction is not really in question anymore. Higher ethanol content is coming. And in several countries, it's already here. The real question is whether the hundreds of millions of vehicles already on the road today, engineered for a fuel chemistry that's rapidly becoming yesterday's standard, make it through that transition with their engines intact. Nobody in Tokyo, Detroit, or Berlin has a complete answer to that yet. It may not fully arrive until the repair data catches up with the policy timeline years from now. The engine under your hood was built for a world that is already shifting around it. Whether it thrives or fails may genuinely come down to something as small as reading the label on the pump before you squeeze the handle, and now that you know what's actually happening in that tank, you're already ahead of most drivers on the road. If this changed the way you'll look at your next fill-up, tell me in the comments which detail surprised you the most: the phase separation, the LSPI mechanism, or the new oil standard almost nobody's talking about yet. And if you want more breakdowns like this one, the kind that dig past the headlines and into the actual engineering, make sure you're subscribed, because the next story is just as wild as this one.